There is a moment that happens to every single one of us, and almost nobody catches it when it does. Not because it's invisible, but because it's so quiet, so ordinary, so completely unremarkable on the surface that your mind just slides right past it like water over glass. Mine happened on a Tuesday. I remember that much. I was sitting in my car in a parking lot outside a grocery store, engine running, hands on the wheel, going absolutely nowhere. I hadn't moved in maybe 10 minutes. I wasn't upset. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. I was just, somehow, completely still. And I mean, still in a way I hadn't been in years. Not the stillness of exhaustion, not the blankness you get after a hard cry or a long day. Something different. Something that felt, if I'm being honest with you, like the moment right before a phone rings. That specific kind of quiet that has a shape to it. The heater was blowing warm air across my hands. There was a shopping cart rolling slowly across the parking lot in the wind, making that hollow, rattling sound on the asphalt. And I just sat there, and something inside me, some frequency I had no language for, went completely, perfectly clear. I didn't understand it then. I didn't understand it for a long time after. But I know now what that moment was. That was the moment I became readable, not to anyone around me, not to anyone I could have pointed to or described, but to something operating at a level of perception so far beyond ordinary human awareness that even calling it perception feels like the wrong word entirely. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds. And I'm not asking you to believe it yet. I'm just asking you to stay with me, because what happened next, and what I eventually learned about what that moment of stillness actually triggered, changed the way I understand every single thing that came before it in my life. Every loss, every dead end, every season where I felt like I was standing still while everyone around me moved forward. All of it recontextualized. All of it suddenly making a kind of sense that I didn't have the framework for until I understood what I'm about to tell you. And here is the first thing I need you to really hear. That moment in the parking lot wasn't the beginning of this story. It was just the moment the story became visible to me. The actual beginning happened much earlier, without my knowledge, without my consent, without any signal to me whatsoever that it was occurring. And that is the part that still, even now, makes the hair on my arms stand up when I think about it. If any of this is landing for you already, if something in your chest just shifted slightly while you were listening, then I want you to subscribe and leave a like, because this story gets significantly stranger from here, and I want you with me for all of it. There is something deeply unsettling about learning that you were being observed before you ever thought to look up. I don't mean observed in the way we usually mean that word. I'm not talking about cameras or algorithms or any of the ordinary surveillance that we've all made a kind of uneasy peace with in our daily lives. I'm talking about something that operates on a level beneath all of that, something that doesn't track your behavior or your location or your purchase history, something that reads the actual quality of your consciousness, the coherence of it, the signal-to-noise ratio of your inner world. And what I eventually came to understand is that this kind of attention had been on me, on the specific waveform of my awareness, long before I ever started asking the kinds of questions that led me to understand any of this. I wasn't a seeker when it started. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. I wasn't meditating. I wasn't reading anything spiritual. I wasn't doing any of the things you might associate with someone who ends up telling a story like this one. I was just living, messily, honestly, with a significant amount of confusion and a low-grade sense that something important was just barely out of reach. But underneath all of that, underneath the noise of daily life and old pain and ordinary distraction, something in me had been quietly doing something, refining itself, not because I chose to refine it, but because life kept applying pressure, and pressure, it turns out, is a kind of instruction. Every time I got knocked sideways and didn't fall apart completely, every time I absorbed something difficult without letting it permanently close me, every time I stayed curious when bitterness would have been the easier response, each of those moments left something behind. Not a memory exactly, something more like a structural trace. A micro-adjustment in the quality of my attention. And those traces accumulated over time into something that, from a certain distance and with a certain kind of perception, looked unmistakably like a pattern, a coherent one, a readable one. And that is when the attention I'm describing became something more than passive observation. That is when whatever had been quietly registering my signal moved from detection into something closer to assessment. I didn't feel it happening. You never do. But looking back now, I can see exactly where the markers were. And the strangest part of all of it, the part I keep coming back to, is that everything I thought was working against me at the time was actually the mechanism by which I became visible. The hardest years were not obstacles to this. They were the process of it. The thing nobody tells you about becoming clearer on the inside is that it feels, at first, almost exactly like falling apart. I want to be specific about that because I think it's important. When people talk about inner growth or alignment or whatever word they want to use for it, they tend to describe it in soft, luminous terms, like you gradually fill with light, like things gently loosen and release. That was not my experience. My experience was closer to what happens when you run a fever that finally breaks. Before the break, everything feels wrong. Your skin is wrong. The sheets are wrong. The temperature of the air in the room is wrong. You can't find a position that's comfortable. You're simultaneously sweating and freezing, and your mind is doing that strange, fevered thing where thoughts arrive and dissolve before you can hold them. And then at some point, usually around 3 or 4 in the morning, something shifts, and you wake up with damp hair and a strange, exhausted clarity. That is what the clearing of my signal felt like. Not peaceful, not graceful, deeply uncomfortable for a long stretch, and then suddenly, almost shockingly, quiet. And here is what I realized much later, after I had the framework to understand what had actually been happening during that period. The discomfort wasn't a sign that something was going wrong. The discomfort was the mechanism. Think about what static actually is. It's not emptiness. It's not silence. Static is information that hasn't been organized yet. It's noise with signal buried inside it. And the process of separating those two things, of pulling the coherent signal out of the surrounding interference, is not a gentle process. It requires pressure. It requires friction. It requires exactly the kind of sustained discomfort that I spent most of that period desperately trying to escape. But I couldn't escape it. And that inability to escape it, that specific experience of being unable to outrun what was happening inside me, turned out to be the exact thing that made the clearing possible. Because every time I tried to distract myself and failed, every time I reached for something to numb the feeling and found it didn't work the way it used to, I was forced back into contact with whatever was actually there. And slowly, without my conscious participation, the noise began to thin. Not because I was doing anything right, but because I had finally, exhaustedly, stopped doing everything wrong. And that is what became readable. Not my virtues, not my spiritual efforts, the specific texture of my exhaustion, and what I chose to do and not do inside of it. That choice, made without drama in the dark of ordinary days, is what crossed the threshold. And I had absolutely no idea it was happening until long after it already had. The assessment, when I eventually understood that one had occurred, was the part of this that took me the longest to wrap my mind around. Because everything about the way we're raised conditions us to think of being evaluated as something that happens with our knowledge and participation. You show up, you present yourself, someone looks at what you've done and tells you whether it's enough. That model is so deeply embedded in the way most of us move through the world that the idea of something else entirely, something that evaluates not what you've done, but what you actually are beneath what you've done, sits wrong in the mind at first. It feels like a violation almost, like someone reading your mail. But the more I sat with it, the more I understood that this kind of assessment is actually the only honest one. Because everything you present consciously is, to some degree, a performance. Not necessarily a dishonest one, but shaped, edited, arranged for the context you're in. What you are when you're not performing, when you're alone in a car in a parking lot with the heater running and a shopping cart rattling across the asphalt and no audience whatsoever, that is the actual data. And that data, that unguarded, unedited, unperformed quality of your inner state, is precisely what this assessment was reading. Not your resume, not your intentions, not your self-concept or the story you tell about who you are and why. The actual structural coherence of your awareness, measured in real time over a long arc under varying degrees of pressure. And the question being evaluated was not whether you were a good person, or a spiritually advanced one, or someone who had done the right things. The question was simpler and far more demanding than any of those. It was essentially this: if we amplify what is already here, Does it stabilize, or does it fragment? That is the only thing that mattered to whatever was conducting this review. Not your potential, not your aspirations, what you actually produce internally when life applies weight to you. And I can tell you that when I first understood that this had been the measure all along, something in me went very, very still, because I realized I already knew the answer, and so did they. I need to tell you about the dreams first, because without them, nothing else in this story makes complete sense. Not dreams in the vague, forgettable way most people mean when they use that word. I mean something far more specific and far more unsettling. I mean the experience of waking up at 6 in the morning with the absolute bone-deep certainty that you have just returned from somewhere real, somewhere that had texture and weight and consequence, and that whatever happened there was not random and was not generated by your sleeping brain trying to process the day's leftovers. These started during the same period I described before, that long, uncomfortable stretch where the noise was thinning and I didn't yet have a name for what was happening. And the quality that made them different from ordinary dreams was this. They didn't feel like stories. They felt like dispatches, like something was using the window of sleep, when all my usual mental noise was temporarily offline, to deliver information that my waking mind would have immediately rejected or rationalized away. And the information was always about me, not my past, not my present, something further forward. I would wake from these experiences with a specific feeling in my chest, not quite emotion, more like the sensation of having just read a document that contained your own name in a context you weren't expecting. A kind of internal recognition that bypassed thought entirely and landed somewhere deeper. I told no one about this for a long time. Not because I was embarrassed, although I was, but because I genuinely had no language for it that didn't sound like something I would have found unconvincing from someone else. But here is what I eventually understood about those dispatches, once I had the framework to interpret them. They were not prophecy. They were not my imagination, constructing wish fulfillment scenarios while I slept. They were something I can only describe as confirmation from a direction I hadn't known existed. The version of me that had already moved through what I was currently in the middle of. That version was somehow, in ways I cannot fully explain and won't pretend to, sending navigational data backward through time. Not dramatically, not in the form of visions or voices or anything cinematic, in the form of a felt sense, a knowing that arrived without a source, a steadiness in specific moments that had no logical origin. And the reason I'm telling you this now, in this part of the story, is because I want you to understand something before we go further. Every moment of inexplicable calm you have ever felt in a situation that should have terrified you, every time you made a decision that logic argued against, and it turned out to be exactly right, every instance of arriving somewhere and feeling, absurdly, that you have been here before, not in this physical place, but in this exact configuration of feeling and circumstance. Those were not coincidences, and they were not generated by you alone. That's the part that changes everything. What I didn't understand for a long time, and what I think most people never understand at all, is that the path to becoming readable didn't look like progress while it was happening. It looked almost exactly like its opposite. There was a period, probably spanning close to 2 years if I'm honest about the timeline, where from the outside, my life appeared to be a series of things not working out. A project I had invested significant time and energy into collapsed quietly, not dramatically, just slowly stopped being viable, and then one day simply wasn't anymore. A friendship that had been central to my life for years reached a point of such fundamental misalignment that continuing it would have required both of us to pretend we were different people than we had become. And a direction I had been moving in professionally, one that I had genuinely believed in and built real plans around, turned out to be a corridor with a wall at the end, rather than a door, one by one, not simultaneously, which would at least have had a certain dramatic clarity to it, but spread out over months, arriving in that slow, grinding rhythm that makes it impossible to call it a crisis, because each individual thing seems almost manageable on its own, even as the accumulation of all of them starts to feel like something is being systematically removed from your life. And I want to be careful here about how I describe what happened inside me during that stretch, because the temptation is to make it sound more heroic than it actually was. The truth is, I was not graceful about it. I was confused, and I was frustrated, and there were long stretches where I was genuinely not sure what I was supposed to be building toward, when so many of the things I had been building kept quietly not becoming what I needed them to become. But here is the thing I only understood much later. Every single one of those endings was surgical, not random, not bad luck, not the universe being indifferent or unkind. Each one removed something that was drawing my signal in a direction that would have cost me, in ways I couldn't see at the time, exactly the kind of coherence that was being assessed. The project would have taken me deeper into a mode of operating that rewarded performance over presence. The friendship was beautiful in many ways, but also kept me anchored to a version of myself I was in the process of outgrowing. And the professional direction, the one with the wall at the end, would have been comfortable enough to keep me from ever finding what was actually meant for me. None of that was visible while it was happening. While it was happening, it just felt like loss. But loss, I was about to learn, has a function that goes far beyond what we typically assign to it. The moment I realized I had been rebuilt without knowing it, I sat down on my kitchen floor and just stayed there for a while. Not dramatically, not in tears, just very, very still. Because what I had just understood was that the thing I had been desperately trying to survive had actually been, the entire time, the thing constructing me. And the version of me sitting on that kitchen floor was structurally different from the version that had entered that 2-year period of quiet collapse. Not better in the way we usually mean better, more load-bearing. The way old timber is more load-bearing than new wood, because it has already contracted and expanded through enough seasons that it no longer shifts unpredictably under weight. I had been seasoned, and I use that word deliberately because seasoning is not a gentle process. It requires exposure to extremes. It requires being subjected to conditions that would destroy lesser material. And what it produces on the other end is not softness. It is a specific kind of density that can hold things that would have cracked the earlier version of me entirely. And here is what I want you to understand about that threshold, the one I described earlier as the eligibility zone, because I think people misread what crossing it actually means. It doesn't mean you become immune to difficulty. It doesn't mean the pressure stops. What it means is that your relationship to pressure changes in a way that is almost impossible to describe from the outside, but completely unmistakable from the inside. Pressure arrives, and instead of triggering that old cascade, the one where one difficult thing activates every other difficult thing you've ever experienced, until the whole system is flooded, something different happens. The pressure lands. You feel the full weight of it, and then something in you just holds. Not because you are strong in the way strength is usually performed, but because the structure beneath you has been tested enough times that it trusts itself in a way it couldn't before. That trust is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in the moment when everything in your history would have predicted collapse, and instead you find yourself, somewhat to your own surprise, still standing, still oriented, still capable of taking the next step, even without knowing where it leads. And that is what became visible. Not the holding itself, but the quality that made it possible. The intelligence I've been describing throughout this story doesn't measure endurance. It measures what you are made of underneath the endurance. And what it found underneath mine was something it had been waiting to confirm for a very long time. The word that most people reach for when they try to describe what I'm talking about is control. They hear that something external is synchronizing with them, and they immediately want to know how to direct it, how to accelerate it, how to use it as a lever to move their life in the direction they've already decided they want it to go. And I understand that impulse completely. I had it myself. The moment I began to understand that something was responding to my internal state, my first instinct was to figure out how to optimize that response, how to present the right frequency, how to perform coherence in a way that would produce the outcomes I was after. And I want to tell you exactly what happened every single time I tried that approach, because it is important. It stopped working. Every time I shifted from being something into projecting something, the responsiveness I had started to notice in my life went quiet. Not dramatically, not with any signal that would tell me I had done something wrong, just a subtle flattening, a return to the sense that I was pushing against a weight that wasn't moving. And it took me longer than I want to admit to understand why. because the thing that had been synchronizing with me was not reading my intentions, it was reading my state, and those two things are not the same. Your intention is what you decide you want. Your state is what you actually are when you stop deciding anything. And the specific quality that had made me readable in the first place, that hard-won, pressure-forged coherence I described in the last part of this story, was not something I could replicate through effort. It was something that existed in me only when I was not efforting, only when I was genuinely, simply present in whatever was actually happening rather than managing my way through it toward a preferred outcome. And the moment I understood that, truly understood it, rather than just intellectually noting it, something in how I moved through my days began to change. I stopped pushing the river, not because I gave up, but because I finally felt, in my actual body, in my chest, in my hands, and the quality of my breathing, that the river was already going somewhere, and that somewhere was not random, and that I had already, without knowing it, been moving in that direction for longer than I realized. The only thing left to do was stop fighting the current. And what happened when I did that is the part of this story I haven't told you yet. The change didn't announce itself. That's the first thing I want to say about it, because I think when people imagine a turning point, they picture something cinematic, a moment with weight and music, and the clear sense that a before and after have just been established. What actually happened was so understated that I almost missed it entirely. I was making coffee one morning, standing at the counter in the early light, and I noticed that the low-level hum of dread that had been present in my chest for what felt like years was simply not there. Not reduced, not quieter than usual. Gone. The way a sound you've lived with so long you stopped registering it is suddenly gone, and the silence it leaves behind is so unfamiliar it takes a moment to understand what you're actually experiencing. I stood there with the coffee in my hand, and I just listened to that silence for a long time. And what I felt in it was not relief, exactly. It was more like the specific feeling of a weight being redistributed. Something that had been pressing down on a single point was now spread across a much wider surface, so wide that no individual part of me felt it anymore as pressure. It had become, somehow, just the texture of being alive. And I want to be precise about what had changed and what hadn't, because this is not a story about everything becoming easy. The external circumstances of my life had not dramatically improved in any obvious way in the weeks before that morning. The same uncertainties were present, the same open questions about direction and purpose that had been sitting at the edge of my awareness for months were still sitting there. But the relationship between me and all of those things had shifted in a way that changed their entire weight. And what I understand now is that this is exactly what a verdict feels like when it lands. Not a proclamation, not a reward, a redistribution. A quiet structural realignment of the field around you, so that what was previously pulling in a dozen incompatible directions starts, very gradually, to point the same way. And that morning in the kitchen, with the light coming through the window at that low, early angle that makes ordinary things look briefly significant, I felt the direction for the first time, not as information, as orientation, like a compass needle that had been spinning for years, finally, quietly, finding north. Here is the exercise I want you to try right now, while you're still listening. Go back in your memory to the thing that hurt the most in the last few years. Not the surface of it, not the story you tell about it, but the actual felt experience of it, the specific quality of that particular loss, or ending, or collapse. Now hold it there for just a moment, and ask yourself honestly, not rhetorically, actually honestly, what did that remove from your life? Not what did it take from you emotionally, but what structure, what direction, what version of yourself or your future did it make impossible to continue with? Because I did this exercise myself after I started understanding what I've been describing in this story, and what I found was so disorienting that I had to sit with it for several days before I could even begin to articulate it. Every single major loss in that 2-year period had removed something that was, and I want you to hear this clearly, pointing me away from where I actually needed to go. Not in obvious ways, not in ways I could have identified at the time, but in retrospect, with the kind of clarity that only becomes available once you're standing far enough from something to see its actual shape. Every ending was directional. The project that collapsed had been consuming the exact hours and mental bandwidth that I would later need for something else entirely. The friendship that ended had been providing a kind of comfort that was also functioning as an anchor, keeping me emotionally located in a past version of myself that I needed to leave behind. And the professional direction that turned out to have a wall at the end, that one is the most interesting to me now, because the wall appeared exactly early enough that I still had the energy and the openness to turn around and find the actual door. 3 months later, and I'm not sure I would have. And here is the part of this that still genuinely unsettles me when I think about it carefully. The timing on all 3 of those endings was precise in a way that chance does not produce. Not precise like a machine, precise like a decision made by something with a much longer view of my situation than I had access to. And when I understood that, when I really felt the weight of it, rather than just thinking it as an abstract idea, the question that arrived in my mind was not one I had expected. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was something much more demanding. It was this: if all of that was arranged with this much care, what exactly is being arranged right now that I can't see yet? I want to tell you about the worst month. Not the hardest year, not the difficult period, the specific worst month, because I think the details of it matter for what I'm about to explain. It was deep into that compression phase I mentioned, the stretch where growth that should have been gradual was being demanded all at once, and I had reached a point where I was genuinely not sleeping well. Not the romantic kind of insomnia, where you lie awake thinking profound thoughts. The grinding, unglamorous kind, where you fall asleep fine, and then your eyes open at 2 in the morning, and your nervous system is already running at full speed for no reason you can identify. I would lie there in the dark, listening to the specific silence of the middle of the night, that particular quality of quiet that has a weight to it, and I would do the thing you're not supposed to do, which is try to think my way to a solution for a feeling that has no cognitive solution. And the feeling was this: that I was working incredibly hard, internally and externally, and that none of it was producing anything visible. That the gap between the effort I was putting in and the results I could point to had become so wide that I had started to genuinely question whether the effort was connected to the results at all, whether I was, in some fundamental way, doing it wrong, wasting the one resource, time, that I couldn't get back. And what made that particular fear so difficult to sit with was that it had enough truth in it to feel legitimate, because the visible results really were lagging. The external evidence really was thin. And from a purely rational standpoint, the argument that I should change direction, cut my losses, stop investing in something that wasn't paying back, was not an unreasonable one. But something in me wouldn't accept it, not out of stubbornness, out of a different kind of knowing, one that I couldn't have explained to anyone in a way that would have satisfied them. A knowing that the lag was not evidence of failure, that it was evidence of depth, that what was being built inside me during that period was not the kind of thing that shows up quickly in external results. It was structural, it was foundational, and foundations, by definition, are invisible until the thing built on top of them becomes undeniable. I held that knowing through the worst month, not gracefully, not without doubt, but I held it, and that holding turned out to be the last thing the assessment needed to see. Now I need to tell you something about yourself, and I want you to actually hear it rather than just process it as a pleasant idea and move on. The thing you have spent the most time apologizing for about the way you experience the world, the sensitivity, the depth of it, the way certain things land on you with a force that seems disproportionate to how lightly they seem to land on other people. That is not a design flaw. I know that's not a new idea. I know you've heard versions of it before, but I want to explain it in a way that is more specific and more useful than the general encouragement it usually gets packaged as. Because here is what I came to understand about my own depth of feeling during this period, once I had stopped fighting it long enough to actually examine it. Feeling deeply is not the same as being governed by feeling, and the distinction between those two things is everything, because a system that cannot feel deeply also cannot receive much information. Feeling is how consciousness takes in data from reality. The more range you have, the more you can detect. The more you can detect, the more accurately you can navigate. The problem is not the depth of feeling, The problem is what you do with it once it arrives. And what the intelligence I've been describing throughout this story was assessing was not whether I felt things intensely, it was whether I could let intensity move through me without becoming it, without fusing my identity to what I was feeling in a given moment. And I want to tell you about the specific moment I understood the difference between those two things, because it was not a meditation or a spiritual practice that showed it to me. It was a conversation I had with someone I was genuinely angry with. Old me would have had that conversation as anger, would have entered it identified completely with the feeling, every word shaped by it, every response filtered through it. And instead, what happened was, I felt the anger fully, every bit of it. It was completely present in my body, tight across my shoulders and hot at the back of my throat. And simultaneously, I was somehow standing slightly to the side of it, watching it, aware of it without being consumed by it. The conversation happened through me rather than as me. And afterward, something in my chest went very quiet, like a system that had just discovered a new gear it didn't know it had. And the question that arrived with that quiet was one I wasn't expecting at all. What nobody warns you about when your inner world starts aligning with something larger is that the amplification works in both directions. I want to be very direct about this because I think it is the most important and the most consistently misunderstood part of everything I've described so far. When people hear that their reality is going to start mirroring their internal state more accurately, more quickly, with less friction between what they hold inside and what appears outside, the assumption is that this is purely good news, and in many ways it is. But it is also, and I say this from direct experience, the most demanding thing that has ever happened to me. Because amplification does not filter. It does not selectively accelerate the nice parts of your inner world while politely ignoring the rest. It amplifies what is actually there, all of it, the clarity and the fear, the genuine intention and the hidden doubt underneath it, the love and the need beneath the love. And in the weeks after that quiet morning in the kitchen, after that compass needle finally settled, I started noticing this in ways that were impossible to dismiss. A low-level anxiety I had been carrying for so long that I had stopped registering it as anxiety and had started experiencing it as just the background texture of being me. That anxiety began appearing in my external life in forms I could not ignore. Small things started going sideways in patterns that were too consistent to be random. Not disasters, friction. The specific kind of friction that arrives when something inside you that hasn't been resolved yet is being asked, with increasing insistence, to be resolved now. And I understood, because of everything I had already learned by that point, that this was not punishment. This was precision. The same intelligence that had arranged the endings I described earlier, the project, the friendship, the professional direction, was now arranging mirrors, placing them at angles where I could not avoid seeing the things in myself that still needed to become coherent before the next level of this could actually hold. And the thing I found in those mirrors was not comfortable, but it was honest. And honest, I was learning, is always more useful than comfortable, even when comfortable is what every part of you is desperately asking for in the moment. The question that arrived with all of this was the one I found hardest to sit with, not because I didn't know the answer, but because knowing the answer required a level of accountability for my own inner patterns that I hadn't fully accepted yet. And accepting it was not a single moment. It was a daily practice of a very specific and very unglamorous kind. The conversation I ended part 12 with, the one where I felt the anger fully without becoming it, that experience left something behind that took me a while to identify. It wasn't pride exactly. It wasn't relief. It was more like the feeling you get when you've been using a tool incorrectly for years, and someone shows you the right grip, and suddenly the tool does 3 times the work with half the effort. A kind of stunned recognition that you had been spending an enormous amount of energy compensating for a misalignment you didn't know was there. And what I started noticing, in the days after that conversation, was that the gap I had discovered between stimulus and response didn't close. It stayed. And it wasn't just present in moments of anger. It was present in smaller moments too. The moment someone said something that would have previously sent me into a loop of self-doubt that lasted hours. The moment a plan fell apart and the old cascade would have begun. That familiar sequence where one thing going wrong activates every other wrong thing until the whole system is flooded and functional thinking becomes impossible. That cascade didn't start. Something caught it at the first step. And the catching wasn't effortful. It wasn't a technique I was applying. It was more like a reflex that had developed without my conscious participation, the way your hand pulls back from heat before your mind has finished processing the sensation. And I want to be clear that this didn't make me calm in an empty way. I still felt everything. The self-doubt arrived. The frustration at the collapsed plan arrived. But they arrived as weather rather than as identity, as conditions passing through a space rather than as the definition of the space itself. And that difference, which sounds subtle when I describe it, and is actually enormous when you live it, turned out to be what the intelligence I've been describing throughout this entire story was measuring when it assessed my attentional coherence. Not whether I had eliminated difficult feelings, but whether I had developed enough interior space to hold them without being governed by them. And once I understood that, the question that followed was immediate and unavoidable. If this gap, this space, is something that can be developed, something that grows through use rather than through effort, then what exactly becomes possible on the other side of it that wasn't possible before? The grief that stopped defining me did it so quietly, I almost didn't notice it was gone. That's the part I keep coming back to when I try to explain the second marker to people, because the absence of something you've carried for a long time doesn't arrive with any kind of announcement. You just reach for it one day out of habit and find that your hand closes on air. There was a loss I had been carrying for several years before all of this began. I'm not going to describe the specifics of it because the specifics aren't the point, and I think you have your own version of this loss, the kind that doesn't have a clean category, that isn't quite grief and isn't quite regret, but contains elements of both. The kind that becomes so familiar over time that you stop experiencing it as pain and start experiencing it as just part of the landscape of being you. It was there when I woke up. It was there in quiet moments. It colored the way I moved through rooms alone and the way I thought about the future, and the particular quality of melancholy that would arrive sometimes on Sunday evenings for no reason I could ever fully explain. And then one evening I was sitting outside. The air had that specific texture of early autumn where it's still warm but something has shifted. You can smell it, something green and faintly cool underneath the warmth, and I realized the melancholy wasn't there, not suppressed, not being managed, simply absent. And what was in its place was not happiness exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than happiness. It was a kind of okayness with time, a sense that the past was the past in a way it hadn't been before, that it had released its claim on the present without me having to fight for that release. And I sat with that for a long time in the cooling air, and I understood that this was not something I had done. This was something that had completed itself inside me while I was busy surviving everything else. The feeling had moved through the system, fully, without getting lodged anywhere. And what remained after it moved through was not emptiness, it was space. And space, I was learning, is not nothing. Space is where the next thing can actually arrive without having to fight for room. Now I need to tell you about the strangest part of this entire experience, because everything I've described so far, the clearing of the signal, the assessment, the verdict, the attentional coherence, the emotional integration, all of it can be understood, with enough patience and willingness, through frameworks that feel at least adjacent to things we already know about human psychology and inner work. This next part cannot. This next part sits in a different category entirely, and I'm going to describe it as precisely as I can, and then let you decide what to do with it. It started with maps. That's the only word I have for what I began experiencing in the months after the verdict landed. Not visual maps, not anything I could have drawn on paper, but a felt sense of terrain, a proprioception. That's the word for your body's awareness of its own position in space, but extended somehow outward into time, into what was coming. And the clearest example I can give you is this. There was a decision I needed to make during that period, a significant one involving a direction I could take my work and my energy, one that looked genuinely promising on the surface, and that several people I respected were actively encouraging me toward. And every time I brought my attention to it, something in my body did something I had not felt before. Not a red flag exactly, not fear or resistance, or any of the signals I had learned to recognize as warning signs. Something more neutral, and more precise than any of those. It felt like placing your hand on a door that is the right size and the right shape and is made of good materials, and then knowing, from the feel of it under your palm, that it doesn't open to where you need to go. Not a bad door, just not your door, and I declined the direction, without being able to explain why in terms that would have satisfied anyone asking. And what opened up in the space created by that decision in the following weeks was something I could not have found if I had gone through the other door, because the other door would have taken me somewhere real and probably fine and completely wrong for what was actually being built in my life at that point. And the navigational sense that caught that felt the difference between a good option and the right one, was not something I had developed intentionally. It had grown in me the way the other markers had grown, through pressure and time, and the accumulated practice of paying attention to what was actually there, rather than what I wanted to be there. And what I understood, standing in the space created by that declined direction, feeling the specific quality of rightness that arrived with it, was that this sense, this temporal awareness, this ability to read the direction of what was unfolding rather than just the surface of what was present, was not a gift. It was a consequence, a natural result of the two things that had developed before it. Because when you can hold your attention steady and let feeling move through you without becoming it, what you gain access to underneath all of that is something very quiet and very accurate, and I was only beginning to understand what it was capable of showing me. The most uncomfortable truth I have ever had to sit with is that the role I was being prepared for is one that will never be applauded. I want to tell you about the moment I understood this, because it arrived in a way I did not expect and through a source I would not have predicted. I was with a group of people I knew reasonably well, a gathering that had started pleasantly enough, but had gradually taken on a charge, that specific tension that builds in a room when unspoken things start pressing against the surface of polite conversation. I hadn't said much. I wasn't managing the situation or trying to steer it. I was just present in it, the way I had learned to be present in things, fully there without trying to shape what was happening. And at some point, without any single intervention I could point to, the charge in the room began to dissipate. The conversation found a different register. The tension didn't resolve dramatically, it just thinned, the way fog thins when the temperature shifts. And I noticed it. And then I noticed something else, which is that nobody else in the room seemed to connect what had happened to my presence in it. The conversation moved on. People were lighter, and I sat with the specific experience of having contributed something real and significant to a situation and being completely invisible as the source of it. And my first reaction, if I'm being honest, was resistance. Something in me wanted the recognition, wanted the moment to be legible, wanted there to be some acknowledgement that something had occurred and that I had been part of it. And then something deeper than that reaction quietly answered it. The recognition would have broken it. The moment this becomes a performance, the moment I enter a room conscious of this role and oriented toward being seen in it, the thing that makes it work disappears entirely, because what functions here is not skill or intention. It is a quality of presence that only exists when it is not being performed. And understanding that, truly understanding it rather than just accepting it intellectually, required me to grieve something. The version of significance I had been raised to want, visible, acknowledged, legible, that version was not what I was being given. What I was being given was real, and it mattered, and it would never have my name on it. And sitting with that, learning to find it enough, was the last and longest piece of work the whole process asked of me. Here is where the story ends, and I want to be precise about what that means, because ending is not the same as finishing. What I have described across everything you have just heard is not a journey that concluded. It is a journey that reached a point where the nature of the traveling changed. The parking lot on that Tuesday, the stillness I described at the very beginning of this, that was not the start of something new. That was the moment I became conscious of something that had been underway for years without my awareness. And everything that followed, the compression, the losses, the assessment, the three markers, the verdict, the invisible role, all of it was always already in motion. I was the last one to know. And I think that is the most important thing I can leave you with, because I suspect it is true for you too. The process you are in right now, whatever it looks like from the inside, whatever it feels like in the specific texture of your daily life, it is not random. The The pressure you are under is not evidence that something has gone wrong. The lag between effort and visible result is not evidence that the effort is wasted. The losses that have felt surgical are not evidence of a universe indifferent to your particular existence. They are evidence of exactly the opposite. Because indifference does not arrange things with this much precision. Indifference is just noise, and what has been happening in your life, beneath the noise of the hard years, is something far more deliberate and far more patient than indifference. The markers develop in the dark. The signal strengthens without announcement. The assessment occurs without your participation, and the verdict, when it comes, arrives not as a gate that opens, but as a ground that firms. You feel it as steadiness, as that strange new weight redistribution I described, as the compass needle that has been spinning for years, finally, quietly, finding north. And the only thing that changes after that is this. The universe stops asking whether you are ready and starts proceeding as though you are. And your only task, from that point forward, is to be honest enough with yourself to match it. Not to perform alignment, not to project coherence, but to actually, daily, in the unglamorous ordinary moments that nobody ever sees, choose it. Because that is what the whole process was always measuring. Not your potential, not your intentions. What you actually do when no one is watching. That is the signal. That has always been the signal. And it has been readable for longer than you know. Now here is the question I want you to sit with and answer honestly in the comments. Because I think your answer will tell you more about where you actually are in this process than anything I could say. What is the one thing in your life right now that keeps ending, keeps falling apart, keeps not working out the way you planned, that some part of you still refuses to stop believing in? Because that refusal, that specific stubbornness in the face of repeated disappointment, is not delusion. It is your signal holding its shape under pressure. And the fact that you can hear that and feel something shift in your chest right now means you already know what I'm talking about. If this story landed for you, if something in it felt true in a way that goes beyond just interesting, leave a like and subscribe, because there is more where this came from, and where we are going next goes even deeper than this.